Hello and welcome to the Wisconsin Ag Law Update. I'm your host, Kelly Wilfert, coming to you live from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today, we'll be diving into the latest legal developments impacting our farm community here in Wisconsin. Whether you're a farmer, agriculture professional, or simply interested in agriculture law, we're glad that you're here. Before we get started, I do like to give a quick disclaimer that today's presentation is for educational purposes only. As I like to say, I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. So today's presentation will provide general information and doesn't create an attorney-client attorney-client relationship between you and myself or you and the university. Before we get started, I am going to launch a quick demographic poll. Since the university is the recipient of federal funds, we are required to ask these questions. It's 4 short questions. Each question does have the option that you can choose, I prefer not to respond, but I will leave that there for just a few moments while we get started. So with all of that handled, what can you expect from today? We have a lot to cover in a very short amount of time. So if you were with us during our last Wisconsin Ag Law update in December, you're familiar with our timer in the upper right-hand corner that's going to help us keep moving along, as well as our list of upcoming topics on the right-hand side. We're going to cover everything from federal legislation, regulation, and case law to state legislation, regulation, and case law. And at the request of our participants from last time, we've also added quite a bit of policy this time around. So thinking about what bills have been proposed and what we can expect. If you're just joining us, we would really appreciate if you fill out that demographic poll for us as we get started. All right. So before we begin, let's do a quick overview of the sources of law that we'll cover today. You probably are most familiar with statutory law or the law that's made by the Wisconsin legislature or Congress. However, the executive branches also have the ability to create administrative law, which we commonly think of as regulation. These might be the rules that come from USDA, DATCP, the DNR, or our other acronym agencies. And it would potentially also include our oh gosh, PowerPoint is being a little goofy today. Apologies for that. Let me just end the poll and I think it'll sort of resolve itself. So we'll get that out of there. So we've talked about legislative and executive. What I was going to say is that executive will also include some of those executive orders that we've been hearing about coming from the president. And then finally, our judicial branch creates common law. So our courts help us to interpret laws, and then those interpretations set a precedent for how the law will be interpreted moving forward. We call that precedent setting stare decisis. All right, let's dive in. Like I said, we're going to include updates in each category of law at both the state and the federal levels. I'm going to start off with federal legislation first. So federal legislation. Congress runs on a 2-year basis, with each year known as a session. We're currently in the first session of the 119th Congress, which is also known as the 2025 calendar year. What you'll see here is that we have 2 different chambers in our federal Congress. We have the House of Representatives, which has 435 representatives, and the Senate, which has 100 senators. Now, the current breakdown by party in these 2 chambers, in both the House and the Senate at the federal level, we currently have a Republican majority with 220 Republican representatives to 213 Democratic representatives and 2 current vacancies. In the Senate, we also have that Republican-controlled chamber with 53 senators who are Republicans to 45 Democratic senators and 2 vacancies. The reason I like to start here is because it shows us that these are some fairly narrow margins, meaning that it really is important for our legislators to work bipartisanly in order to pass legislation. But we've seen so far this year, perhaps not quite as much legislation being passed. There's been a lot of activity from the executive branch, but what has Congress been up to? One of the primary focuses so far for Congress is a focus on the budget. As you might remember, in 2024, the 118th Congress passed a continuing resolution that carried the budget through March of this year. And then in order to prevent a government shutdown at that time, our current 119th Congress passed another continuing resolution. So that's where we're at today. That's what's going to carry us through September 2025, the end of the federal government's fiscal year. What that means is Congress is now looking at the future. What we just saw happen was that the House and the Senate passed a concurrent resolution for budget year 2025 and spending levels for 2026 to 2034. So what does that mean? Essentially, what the concurrent resolution does is it sets buckets. So they're going to say X number of dollars are allocated to this particular budget function, but there are, I want to say it's 12 or 16. I'm a little off on my numbers at the moment, but it's a small number of budget categories where they're allocating funding to. And then within those categories, the House and the Senate are going to have to go back and actually figure out what are the smaller tweaks or the more specific tweaks that are going to get us to that point. So the concurrent resolution that we see right now is not law. It's enforceable as a point of order. So it sets our large buckets. What are those dollar amounts going to be? Sort of outlines the priorities. And now Congress has to move forward with reconciliation bills. So the budget is about 2/3 mandatory spending and 1/3 discretionary spending. Mandatory spending means that spending is authorized by current law. So committees now need to take these changes to the large bucket and figure out what legislation they can change to bring spending in line with the new spending limits. And that'll all go into the reconciliation bill. Think of it this way. So maybe you have a monthly budget for yourself, and let's say that your food budget is $500. It's not necessarily going to say, I'm going to spend $40 at Panera, and I'm going to spend $300 at the grocery store, but it's going to be $150 at this grocery store and $150 at this grocery store. Nope. The concurrent resolution sets that dollar number, that $500 for food. Now in reconciliation, the committees are going to try to figure out, how do we get there? What are those breakdowns looking like? So what does this mean for agriculture? Well, let's connect this over to the Farm Bill. The current extension of the Farm Bill runs through September 30th of this year, which means that we are once again hoping that the Farm Bill will get picked up by Congress this year. Although, as you can see, they're fairly busy with that reconciliation process, which might hold up the Farm Bill. What some trade organizations and lobbyists have suggested is that they think that the Farm Bill, certain titles may get picked up during reconciliation, while others are going to have to be figured out down the road. Another piece that we really want to think about as we're thinking about the budget is what's going to happen to tax. Specifically, I want to talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2018. So this law was passed, as you can probably imagine, in 2018, 2019. And what it did is it changed some of our tax provisions to what we're experiencing this year in 2024, 2025. So if you think all the way back, you might remember that what we saw this year, what you just finished your taxes for 2024, We had some reduced income rates and some higher standard deductions. We had some expanded child tax credits. We had the alternative minimum tax, the 20% deduction for qualified business income. We also had bonus depreciation, although that's been phasing out over the last number of years. And we had an increased unified estate and gift tax credit. So what would this potentially mean for agriculture? These are the provisions that are expected to expire at the end of this year, the end of 2025, and be phased out by 2026. However, as Congress has been talking about the budget, they've also been talking about revenue and how taxes may or may not change. With the bucket that was reserved for a change in revenue, we recognize that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, extending that program, would cost essentially about what the allotted change was. However, the current administration has also expressed an interest in no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. Those are all items that would also reduce revenue in the same way that these expiring provisions reduced revenue for the federal government. So if we do see those new provisions, no tax on tips or overtime or Social Security, then what from our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doesn't get extended? We don't have those answers yet, but it'll be something to keep an eye on, especially as folks are thinking about farm succession. That unified estate and gift tax credit is key. All right, let's step away from the budget and start to think about other legislation. I always like to remind folks when we talk about legislation that there are thousands of bills introduced each year, which means that we simply aren't able to cover them all. I wanted to give you just a flavor of what that looks like. So looking at the House Agriculture Committee, so far in 2025, there have already been 183 bills introduced and referred to the House Ag Committee, another 327 bills introduced and referred to the House Natural Resources Committee, and in the Senate, 106 bills introduced and referred to the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, and 144 bills introduced and referred to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. All I want you to take away from that is there is a lot of activity, and it can be somewhat difficult to predict what might make it through to actually becoming law, as well as to figure out how do we narrow it down? What do we want to talk about in the 1 hour that we have together today? I will say I tried to rank by co-sponsorship as I was looking at the bills that we're going to talk about today. And that's because if we have a large number of folks supporting them, it does appear to be something that there's a little bit more weight behind, a little bit more likelihood that it might move. So you can see again on that right-hand side, we've got a whole bunch of federal legislative proposals that we'll be going through. Hopefully you see something that interests you. So the first one I want to talk about is whole milk for healthy kids. Again, this was a bill, so it's been proposed but isn't law yet. And it mirrors the legislation that was introduced during the last Congress, which passed the House but then died in the Senate. Essentially, what whole milk for healthy kids would do is allow schools that participate in the school lunch program to serve whole milk, which of course would be a large market open for Wisconsin dairy producers. To give you a sense of what's happening with this bill so far, right now there are 114 co-sponsors in the House. 6 Wisconsin representatives are co-sponsoring this legislation, and there are 13 co-sponsors in the Senate. So in the Senate, this has been referred to the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and they've started holding hearings. And in the House, this was passed in order to be reported as amended by their Committee on Education and Workforce. So slightly different classification here, but something that had interest in the past and is continuing to potentially move forward this year. The next piece of legislation that we'll talk about is the Honor Farmer Contracts Act of 2025. This is a bill that was introduced in the Senate, actually co-sponsored by Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin and referred to the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. This bill reaches out to some of the challenges that farmers have expressed based on federal funding being frozen. So this particular bill, if it were to be passed, it would instruct the Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to unfreeze funding for all agreements or contracts entered into by USDA, pay all past due amounts owed under those contracts, not cancel agreements or contracts with farmers or entities providing assistance to farmers unless that farmer has failed to comply with the agreement, and not close any county farm service agency or NRCS field office without at least 60 days prior notice to Congress. We'll talk in a little bit. There also is some ongoing case law, I shouldn't say ongoing case law, but ongoing lawsuits, ongoing cases related to the frozen funds. So we'll see that different branches of government are looking at this issue in different ways. The next bill that we will talk about is the SAFE Act of 2025, which has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. This bill would permanently prohibit the slaughter of equines, so horses, mules, for human consumption. In recent years, you're probably thinking, we don't do this already. But in recent years, it's actually been the Appropriations Acts, so the funding bills, that have prohibited USDA from using federal funding to inspect horses before they're slaughtered for human consumption. And since they aren't inspected, they, of course, can't be sold and consumed. This bill changes the approach there. So rather than addressing it through appropriations, it would just prohibit the slaughter of equines for human consumption in law outright. So this has 114 co-sponsors in the House. 2 of those are from Wisconsin and 1 co-sponsor in the Senate. And as you can see, it's been referred to committees on agriculture in both the House and the Senate. The next bill that I'm going to talk about is the Healthy Poultry Assistance and Indemnification Act of 2025. You might notice HPAI. That's probably a familiar term for those of us who've been hearing about highly pathogenic avian influenza. So you'll notice legislators sometimes do fun things with the acronyms, and we see that in the title here. So this bill has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. Current law provides that during an extraordinary emergency, APHIS can hold, seize, treat, apply other remedial actions, destroy, or dispose of any animal necessary to prevent the dissemination of the pest or disease, and that owner is compensated. So as we're thinking about HPAI, we might think about some of those bird flocks that have been destroyed and the owner reimbursed. This bill would extend that power to animals that are located in a control area, even if that animal or that facility is not affected. So essentially, it's the idea that APHIS could go ahead and reach further than just the impacted flock in this situation to a control area, even if the animals in that control area are not affected. It also establishes a new compensation formula based on the owner's average income from the last 5 flocks. So right now there are 15 co-sponsors in the Senate, 11 co-sponsors in the House, and of course it's been referred to their committees on agriculture. This is probably particularly relevant for those of us here in Wisconsin as we think about the recent announcement that there was a Sheboygan flock that was impacted by HPAI recently, and you may have read about the control area that was set up around that flock. Again, keep in mind, this is not law yet, so that control area is not necessarily, those animals are not going to be destroyed, although I believe they're quarantined. But this bill would give APHIS the ability to do that, and again, to compensate those owners if they needed to, and if this bill passed. As we're talking about HPAI, I did want to make sure to provide some additional information for anyone who does have interest. So DATCAP, the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, has their poultry biosecurity guidelines, including a biosecurity checklist, available at the link listed there. Feel free to take a photo or a screenshot of this slide if this is something you're interested in. The department or DHS has farm worker health and safety information available as well. So thoughts about, resources about how we protect our farm workers, about providing personal protective equipment or PPE. You can use that same link to find resources around PPE. Farms and other facilities are encouraged to buy and provide their own PPE to employees and visitors. But DHS is able to make some free PPE available while supplies last, and a link to the forms to request that is at that same link. HPAI, of course, has had a significant impact on poultry and including on some dairy farms here in the United States. Wisconsin, of course, is just starting to see that potential impact. But always encourage folks to take biosecurity very seriously, whether it's HPAI or any other daily activity on your farm. The next category that I'm going to talk about is foreign investment in U.S. agriculture. And you'll notice that we have a whole list of bills here. And actually, there's another slide or two of even more. And so I grouped this all under one category because there has been so much interest in how are we addressing foreign investment in U.S. agriculture. So the Farm Act, the Farmland Act of 2025, the Farmland Security Act of 2025, the Land Act, I'll click forward and then click back, the Protecting America's Agricultural Land from Foreign Harm Act, No American Land for Communist China Act, Securing American Agriculture Act. This has been a hot topic, both in the agriculture community and, of course, with representatives and senators out in Washington, D.C. So I'm not going to go through each of these acts individually, but what you do want to know is that they cover or propose a variety of topics from increasing the review of investment that results in foreign control of U.S. ag business to increasing penalties for failing to complete the agricultural foreign investment disclosures. Several of them include requiring USDA or the Secretary of Agriculture to research and report on foreign ag leasing and ownership trends and the impact on U.S. agriculture. Some of those are one-time reports. Some of those are recurring reports. The Land Act here would require foreign purchasers to be subject to the same restrictions that their home country would impose on a U.S. citizen. So sort of a reciprocal idea there, kind of interesting. Some of these are broadly interested in addressing foreign investment. Some are specific to China, the one that you see at the top, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. So again, the takeaway here is there's a lot of interest in legislation around foreign investment in U.S. agriculture. We'll have to wait and see if the folks that are involved with all of these can come together and move forward with one plan. And I didn't mention, but I will mention there is, of course, some Wisconsin involvement with the co-sponsorship. So, for example, No American Land for Communist China. There is one Wisconsin representative co-sponsoring that. On our prior page, Senator Baldwin actually introduced the Farmland Security Act of 2025. So again, some interest from Wisconsin representatives and senators as well. All right, moving on to wolves. So wolves are, of course, always a hot topic in Wisconsin agriculture, especially depending on the area that you are located in. The Pet and Livestock Protection Act, which is a House bill, would remove the gray wolf from the Federal Endangered Species Act. The Senate has a similar bill. It's not called or titled exactly the same, but I included that Senate bill number because the impact is the same. So the Endangered Species Act makes it illegal to take any species that's on the list. So that would be pursuing them, hunting them, shooting them, killing them, trapping them. A fairly extensive list that the law provides that a taking of those endangered species is illegal. Now, this particular bill would remove that gray wolf from the list, opening up some opportunities to manage or address that population at a state level instead. What I also want to mention is that there has also been ongoing conversation about whether the Endangered Species Act itself may be amended. The current federal administration has expressed some interest in redefining take, which would change what that legislation or what that law currently does. You'll see, again, like I mentioned, proposed in both the House and the Senate. There are 33 co-sponsors in the House, with 6 of them being Wisconsin representatives, 3 co-sponsors in the Senate, and this bill was actually introduced by Senator Ron Johnson. All right, we've gotten through a lot of policy at the federal level in our first half hour or so. We're going to move on to federal regulation. As a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will circle back to all of those questions at the end. So federal regulation. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is the regulatory hold that was imposed by executive order on January 20th, 2025. Now, this regulatory freeze is fairly standard with a new president. It's happened with the last several. And essentially what it says is that agencies should not propose or issue any new rules until those drafts are reviewed and approved by President Trump's administration. It also set a recommendation that agencies consider a 60-day pause on any published or final rules which have not yet taken effect. That 60 days was up in late March. And so we may see some of those moving forward. But essentially, what happens here when we have that transition in a president and his administration, our presidents, again, commonly put out this executive order asking agencies to just hold on issuing rules until their administration has a chance to review that policy. All right. The next regulation we'll talk about is the Corporate Transparency Act. And if you're looking at this slide going, not this again, Beneficial Ownership Reporting Corporate Transparency Act, good news, we get to throw out this rule for the most part. So this rule essentially was going to require U.S. companies to report their beneficial owners. So who is the man behind the mask? Who are those actual owners behind an LLC or a corporation, and provide that information to the federal government to help with financial crimes enforcement. There was quite a bit of litigation around this rule all around the country. And what ultimately ended up happening is that when the Trump administration took over, they worked with FinCEN and decided that instead of the rule as it had previously existed, they issued an interim final rule that said all entities that were created in the United States, including those that were known as domestic reporting companies, and their beneficial owners are exempt from the requirement to report beneficial ownership information. So what that means is that foreign entities doing business here may still be required to submit beneficial ownership information, but they were removing that requirement for domestic companies. Now, this is an interim final rule that was effective March 26th of 2025. If anyone does want to provide comments on that, comments are due May 27th, 2025. And I will say, you'll see RIP there. This has been a rule that ag law and really most lawyers around the country followed very intensely because of the large number of companies that it was going to impact. and it has been a back and forth battle of whether beneficial ownership would go into effect or not. So we finally have a decision that it will not go into effect for our domestic companies, and that our Wisconsin farms who are organized here do not need to submit their beneficial ownership information to FinCEN. Keep in mind, if you work with a lender, you have any financing, you typically are required to report this information to the bank anyway. So you may still have to report it, just not to FinCEN. All right. The next regulation that I want to chat about stems from the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule, which has been in effect since January of 2016. We have some updates for 2025. We are seeing the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements go into, I shouldn't say go into effect, but go into effect for compliance purposes. So the new requirements for agricultural water moved to a research-based method of annual risk assessments as opposed to the testing that was done on a very regular basis. Compliance deadlines are different depending on the size of the farm. You'll want to review this particular rule if it is something that applies to you. If you're a large farm under their classification, compliance is this year. If you are a small farm under their classification, you have until April of 2026. And if you are a very small farm, we are looking at April of 2027, so 2 years away. In addition, I want to remind folks of the food traceability final rule, which adds additional record-keeping requirements for faster identification and rapid removal of potentially contaminated food. Exemptions to this may apply. I would really strongly encourage you to check that rule and see if it's something that you are obligated to comply with, since compliance is required by January 20th of 2026. Our next topic is more of just a notice, reminding folks that the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program was announced. This is called ECAP. ECAP is going to issue up to $10 billion in one-time economic assistance payments to eligible producers of eligible commodities for the 2024 crop year. And you can see a list of those eligible commodities at the bottom: wheat, corn, sorghum, barley, oats. I won't read them all for you, but keep in mind that if this is something that you qualify for, you will want to reach out to FSA and think about getting started on those applications. Our next topic comes to us from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, labeling plant-based alternatives. So this particular, I have it in the regulation category because it's coming from our regulatory agencies, but this isn't actually a regulation. This is draft guidance, not a proposed rule. But the FDA has released draft guidance for the industry on how to label plant-based alternatives to animal-derived foods. So for example, you see their plant-based chickpea and lentil-based fish sticks. A few other examples in their guidance are soy-based cheddar cheese, soy and wheat jerky. So those plant-based alternatives to otherwise animal-derived foods. What the guidance talks about is how these alternatives should be named. It does indicate that if it has a common or usual name of the food, that should be used in some way. So for example, fish sticks, most of us on the call probably have a familiarity with that term. And so they say, hey, folks who are producing plant-based alternatives, you should still use that common name. And if there's not one, make sure you're using some statement of identity that describes the food. But they also say that, or they also recommend that industry use the name of the standardized food qualified by the type of plant source. So again, that idea of putting soy-based cheddar cheese so that you have that plant-based information at the very top of the labeling. Again, it's guidance, it's not a rule. but certainly something that folks may be interested in. Keep in mind that this particular guidance is for plant-based alternatives to eggs, seafood, poultry, meat, and dairy products, except plant-based milk alternatives. The reason that plant-based milk alternatives are excluded is because they were covered in a different set of draft guidance. But if that's something that you would be interested in providing comments on, FDA is accepting comments on that through May 7th of 2025. So we've got a couple weeks left here if you'd be interested in commenting on that. Recently in the news, you may have seen Secretary Brooke Rollins, the Secretary of Agriculture, announce that they have reformed, not canceled, she says, but reformed the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities Initiative into the Advancing Markets for Producers Initiative. USDA says that they will be reviewing any existing grant agreements based on 3 policy priorities. A minimum of 65% of federal funds must go to producers. They must have enrolled at least one producer as of December 31st and must have made a payment to at least one producer as of December 31st. The press release from USDA says that they will contact their current partners individually to provide information about future participation and that they will honor all eligible expenses incurred prior to April 13th. So who does this impact in the state of Wisconsin? I went ahead and pulled a list for folks of the grant recipients that were part of the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. I will also mention on the left-hand column, Yale University was also listed there. They were the only one I couldn't fit on the slide, and so I hoped that since we had them in a few other places, that would suffice. But a few that you have perhaps heard about, Low Carbon Technologies LLC, Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative, the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship. Edge had their Farmers for Sustainable Food program. The Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship had a network of 30 farms with paddock track technology to serve as training sites. You might see True Terra on there, which was Land O'Lakes carbon credit program. So some familiar names that if you potentially were involved with one of these or were supportive of one of those grant programs, just want to let you know that there have been some changes and may continue to be some changes coming with those. All right, and we are going to move into federal case law with a slide that is a bit of a crossover as we talk about executive orders. I had mentioned earlier that executive orders are really more of that, well, it's that regulation, that executive action coming from that executive branch of government. The reason that I'm including them in federal case law is so that we can talk about what's going on at the White House. We have seen more executive orders from our current administration than is typical of past administrations. And we're also hearing a lot of news about lawsuits, legal challenges to those executive orders. So rather than dive into any one case, what I want to talk about is how does this process work? When there is a challenge to a law or a regulation, those challenges are typically managed through the court process. And so that's what's happening with these executive orders, is that folks who disagree with them or feel that they may be unlawful are reaching out to the courts and asking the court to step in and decide, is this order legal or not? Now, when we talk about the court system, these are going to be in the federal court system because, again, they are federal executive orders, and that's where the court that will have jurisdiction. Those lawsuits are required to be brought first in the federal district court. So you may have heard the federal district court of the District of Columbia. In Wisconsin, we have the Eastern and Western districts of Wisconsin. The district court for South Carolina, and there are different branches there. Each state is going to have some of these district courts. And then those district courts are going to hear that issue first. Think of that like your local circuit court if we were trying a state court issue. So whether that's Manitowoc County or Eau Claire County, your federal district court is that first court that's going to hear the issue. After the conclusion of that case, if one party or the other, whether that's the plaintiff or the defendant, isn't pleased with the outcome, they have the opportunity to appeal it to the Federal Appeals Court. The Federal Appeals Court is going to review the work of the Federal District Court. They're going to make sure that they applied the right laws, make sure they applied the laws correctly, and just generally really review their work. Now, again, if the decision here is not what the plaintiff or the defendant was hoping for, they might again appeal up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has an option. They get to select which cases they're going to hear, and they can deny hearing others. But what I'm trying to show here is that there's a long road ahead of us on some of these executive orders. Just to give you a flavor of some of those that might impact Wisconsin agriculture, we have Butterbee Farm versus USDA that was filed in the District Court for the District of Columbia, which was a legal challenge to USDA, NRCS, and FSA, or Farm Service Agency funding being pulled. So far, it's just a complaint that's been filed. We haven't gotten into discovery. We haven't gotten into motions, which means we are a little ways out from a decision on that. There also was the Sustainability Institute versus Trump filed in the District Court for South Carolina, which related to the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the funding freezes there. That case is a little bit further along. They've started going through some of the preliminary discovery steps, which is information gathering. And then the federal administration has filed a motion for a protective order citing attorney-client privilege and a few other protections and privileges, essentially saying, hey, we're not going to provide all of the requested discovery because we have legal reasons why we can't. But similarly, that one also hasn't really proceeded far enough to know the outcomes. And that's sort of why I wanted to talk more about the process than specific cases today. Quite frankly, your guess is as good as mine on several of these. Lawsuits take time. And so it is going to take some time to work through the variety of legal challenges and see what is decided and what holds at the federal level. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left, so we're going to move into state legislation. And one of the priorities with state legislation, much like our federal legislature, is our state budget. But before we talk about the state budget, let's talk about what's happening with our state legislature. So far, we have had 5 bills signed into law in 2025. Now, the Wisconsin legislature, it's a little easier for me to review all of the bills that have been proposed as opposed to the federal legislature, where I mentioned we have several thousand proposals that we could go through. Here in Wisconsin, the House has introduced, as of noon yesterday, 201 bills, and the Senate has introduced 217 bills. Now, these are coming from all different folks and on all different topics. But just like we talked about with our federal legislature, I want to point out that the House here in Wisconsin, or the Assembly, I should have that say, the Assembly has a Republican majority with 54 Republican Assembly persons and 45 Democratic. And then in the Senate, there are 18 Republican senators and 15 Democratic senators. So still some fairly slim margins. And of course, in Wisconsin, we have a Democratic executive, meaning that we really do need bipartisan work to get bills passed. So again, there have only been 5 bills signed into law, not so far in 2025. They weren't wildly applicable to agriculture. And so like on the federal level, we're going to talk a lot about proposals and what's going on with proposed bills in Wisconsin. I mentioned I want to touch on first the state budget because this has been a priority for our legislature right now. Wisconsin operates on a 2-year budget, with our next budget set to run from July 1st of this year to June 30th of 2027. So last fall, state agencies submitted budget requests to the Department of Administration, and from there, the governor put together his executive proposal, which was released in February. From that executive proposal, that moves on to the Joint Finance Committee of the Wisconsin legislature. Now, as we just saw, we have Republican majorities in the Assembly and the Senate, and we have a Democratic executive. So what we typically see in that type of situation is that the Joint Finance Committee is sort of going to start over, and they're going to reform a lot of the proposals coming from the governor. At this point, we haven't seen a draft from the Joint Finance Committee. My understanding from chatting with some of the folks on that committee is that they were waiting to get past tax day and see what revenue looked like before they wanted to put out that final proposal. Keep in mind, though, we are already at April 18th, and the budget is intended to be signed and effective by July 1st. So there's a lot of work to do in just a short couple of months here. If you have interest in providing input on the budget, there will be a public hearing with the Joint Finance Committee in Hayward on April 28th and in Wausau on April 29th. There were 2 others in other parts of the state, but those dates have passed. If you want to just submit written comments, that link is on the slide for you as well. Again, grab a screenshot or take a picture if you're interested in providing comments on what goes into the budget, the state budget. All right, let's move on to state legislation. Number of interesting things going on this year. So the first bill that I will talk about, again, reminder that the state legislation topics I'm going to talk about are bills. They're proposals, they're not law yet. The first is seed potato legislation. The current law requires that anyone planting 5 or more acres of potatoes use certified seed potatoes, although DATCP can waive that restriction under certain conditions. So for example, if there is a shortage of certified seed potatoes, there's a disease issue, there are a variety of reasons that DATCP might be able to waive the restriction. What the bill would do is add the ability for DATCP to include geographic restrictions as far as a condition of the waiver. So you don't have to use certified seed potatoes, but it must be planted within this region versus a broader waiver. It also gives DATCP the ability to order violators to destroy any potatoes involved in a violation, and if they don't comply, to step in and do it themselves. It does also add fines of up to $5,000 plus not more than $5,000 an acre planted in violation. We also have a bill relating to unlicensed drivers. So state statute currently prohibits permitting your vehicle to be operated by an unlicensed driver with a penalty of not more than $100. This bill would increase the penalty to up to $1,000 for a first-time offense and up to $10,000 for a second or subsequent offense. So when I think about farmers, I think about how would this apply to unlicensed employees who are driving a farm vehicle, or to children who don't have a license and are operating a farm vehicle. There, of course, still are restrictions for tractor safety and how those programs work, but this would be vehicles operated on roadways by unlicensed drivers, significantly increasing those penalties. Another bill is our grazing transition to grazing pilot program bill. So this would create a pilot program in DATCP to support farmers who are implementing forage-based managed grazing systems. It would provide up to $40,000 per grantee, with up to 75% or $30,000 awarded in the first year, and then up to 12.5% in each of the second and the third years. We also have a few bills in Wisconsin right now around equipment repair. So we have the right to repair bill, which would require agricultural equipment manufacturers to make certain information available at fair costs and fair terms to allow folks to repair their own equipment. So enough documentation, whichever embedded software, firmware, parts, or tools that are needed to facilitate that repair, they would have to make available. In addition, we also have a bill, think of it like a lemon law for implements of husbandry. So if you're familiar with a lemon law for vehicles, when you purchase a new car or new truck, if there are substantial defects that require repair while it's under warranty, there are certain restrictions that say after so many hours or so many days, manufacturer, you just need to replace this vehicle and give the person a new vehicle. So this bill would create the same for implements of husbandry. So again, our agricultural equipment, saying that, look, if this is under warranty and after hours and hours of repair or dollars and dollars of repair, it's still not fixed, you need to simply replace that. All right, our next topic talks about local control. So we have 3 bills right now in the Wisconsin legislature. I should say 6, 3 topics in the Wisconsin legislature that are around this idea of local control for different topics. So we have one that is on vegetable gardens and would prohibit your cities, villages, towns, and counties from requiring a permit for or prohibiting cultivation of a vegetable or flower garden on a residential property. So essentially it says, hey, local municipality, you can't restrict vegetable or flower gardens. That doesn't include HOAs. So just keep that in mind. And then fowl, so chickens or poultry. This bill would prohibit those same local subdivisions, your cities, villages, towns, and counties from prohibiting the keeping of 4 or less birds on a residential property. It does, unlike the vegetable garden bill, it does allow some restrictions on cleanliness, roosters, and requiring some permitting. So again, these are sort of about local control. Should these decisions be made locally or at the state level? We're going to flip a little bit when we talk about solar. So the local control bill related to solar actually moves control back from the state back towards those cities, villages, and towns. So currently solar projects of 100 megawatts or more are permitted by the Public Service Commission. And when I say permitted, I mean that the application process and the permit issuance goes through the PSC. This bill would require approval from each city, village, or town that would have land involved before the Public Service Commission could issue these permits. So whereas vegetable and poultry, we are sort of moving that power to restrict away from our local municipalities. With solar, this bill would move it back towards those local municipalities. There also is another bill related to solar and wind projects right now. I'm not going to read through the 5 issues or the 5 topics on this particular slide in detail. I want you to know that it has 5 primary components to it. And this is actually pulled from the bill author's text of what this bill is intended to do. But I want to narrow in on the number of ways that it might actually impact our landowners who are potentially subject to this. So for example, actually I should go back real quick and just point out what it does is it's adding certain requirements. So we're really going to focus on number 3 here, imposing additional requirements on construction, including the purchase of certain ag conservation easements. So what are those additional submission requirements? Decommissioning and site storage plans, including some financial assurance obligations for the cost of decommissioning, drainage plans, providing visual screening for certain properties that have a residence within 250 feet, attempting to enter good neighbor agreements, providing written notice to the local political subdivisions, so again, our cities, towns, villages, where each project would be located, and try to negotiate an economic development agreement with them. Written notice to each property owner within 1 mile of the proposed facility, and then post notice of the proposed project at least 45 days before submitting the application in an official state newspaper. This bill would require all of these additional requirements to occur before the project submitted an application to the Public Service Commission. So I will let you determine pros or cons. If you've been through any of our solar programming, a number of these are items that we strongly encourage folks to consider thinking about as they're negotiating a contract, since there is not currently law in place related to these. So this bill would shift some of that burden from the contracting landowner onto the energy developer. Whether that is good, bad, or otherwise, I will leave up to you to decide. The other component of this bill, we talked about the necessity or the requirement to purchase agricultural conservation easements. So if this bill were to pass, the owner of an energy system would have to purchase ag conservation easements on 4 acres of prime farmland for each acre of land that the system is located on that was prime farmland, having an NCCPI of 0.8 or greater. And then there are a few other proportions depending on what the land looks like. One other bill that we'll talk briefly about, which is one that I thought was kind of fun, we currently have a proposal in the Senate that would require public eating places to not serve food identified as maple syrup unless the product is made entirely of maple syrup. So if you are a maple syrup producer, that may be of interest to you. Now, the next slide that I'm going to talk about is going to talk about bills that have not truly been introduced yet, but are being circulated amongst the members of the legislature for co-sponsorship, which means that we know they're coming soon. So one such proposal is for a sustainable aviation fuel tax credit, which would provide $1.50 per gallon of sustainable aviation fuel produced in Wisconsin. Keep in mind that the definition, though, is that the energy crops used to produce the sustainable aviation fuel must be grown within the United States. So what you want to keep in mind as a farmer is that this state level tax credit would be paid to the producers of the fuel, but it might create some additional market for farmers who are raising crops that could be used. Another item being circulated is the Wisconsin Green Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment preserving the right to clean, safe, and healthy natural environment. We don't know exactly yet what might be included in that, but something to keep an eye on as it comes through to think about how it might impact Wisconsin agriculture. We are going to fly through state regulation with the couple of moments that we have left. Wanted to let folks know there are a couple of opportunities to serve on boards and committees. The Wolf Advisory Committee nominations or applications for that are due May 4th of 2025. The Soybean Marketing Board and the Cranberry Board applications or nominations for those are both due May 30th of 2025. You also want to keep in mind that DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, is requesting public input on deer management through their county deer advisory councils. Those meetings are being held from April 21st to May 1st. I would encourage you, if you have interest in this, to go online or reach out to your local DNR representative or local county deer advisory council representative to identify when your county meeting will be held if you'd like to attend. You can also submit questions to the email provided there. And then state case law, I'm going to touch just briefly on permitting for the Wisconsin Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits. So you may be familiar with the fact that DNR regulates the discharge of pollutants to state waters, and that concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, in Wisconsin are required to get one of these permits. What I wanted to let you know is we've had some cases going on this topic. The first is one called Coudray Lakes Association versus Zawistowski. This is now law. The court held that cranberry frost protection and harvest flooding were irrigation returns that were exempt from requiring a WPDES permit. So cranberry bogs that are flooding their bogs are not required to have this permit. Now, on the other hand, B&D Dairy LLC versus the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. This dairy farm was going through a permit renewal process, and DNR issued a permit with conditions. The dairy farm argued that the conditions were unlawful and not supported by substantial evidence, but they were upheld by the administrative law judge, the circuit court, and the Court of Appeals. In addition, the Wisconsin Dairy Alliance, Inc. and Venture Dairy Cooperative also have sued the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, alleging that certain rules exceed statutory authority. The Calumet County Circuit Court upheld both rules, and while the case was pending with the Court of Appeals, because again, remember, we're starting at that circuit court level, moving up to the Court of Appeals, and then if we don't like that decision, we can go to the Supreme Court. In this instance, the plaintiffs tried to file a bypass petition to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, saying, hey, can we just come to you guys and you'll make the decision? But in January of this year, the Supreme Court denied that bypass petition. So the case will have to be heard by the Court of Appeals first. All right, we are just wrapping up here at 1 o'clock. As we wrap up, I will do some questions and answers, but wanted to share again that this webinar series is in response to the challenge of our Wisconsin farmers and agricultural service professionals in accessing legal information about laws and regulations. So while we don't provide legal advice, my goal is really to help folks stay up to date on what's happening in Wisconsin agriculture law. I would love it if you could answer 2 polls for me while we transition into Q&A. The first will be an evaluation poll on our event today. It has 2 questions. If you are interested in providing additional feedback on today's event, you can also go to the follow-up survey at go.wisc.edu. I will very quickly make sure that I get you that link in the chat as well, so that if you'd like to just click on it. Of course, it doesn't want to do that for me, so I will type it in there that you can do so. So there is that link in the chat as well. All right, I'm going to leave this poll question open for just a moment, and then when I say just a moment, let's go another 15 seconds. And then I'm going to launch a second poll question. So some of you may be familiar with the Wisconsin Agricultural Outlook Forum that's held each January. I was honored to speak at that event this year, and am on the committee for looking at continuing that event and what it's going to look like moving into the future. You'll notice on the follow-up survey, there's a question there related to that event about, do you like how it looks? What should be different? Do you have comments, suggestions? So if you have attended that event, please go ahead and respond to that. I'm going to go ahead and end our Ag Law Update evaluation poll and then launch our Ag Outlook Forum poll. Y'all are going to be polled out in a little bit here, but just wondering if you're familiar with the Wisconsin Ag Outlook Forum. Typically UW-Madison, UW-River Falls, and UW-Platteville speakers go ahead and provide some economic updates on what to expect for the markets moving into the upcoming year. So if that sounds familiar, we'd love to know. And then question 2 is, if you were going to attend that event, what would you be most looking for out of that event? Again, we always are trying to update our programs to make sure that you're getting the most out of them and that they're serving your needs. So really do appreciate your feedback on the poll, the live polls, as well as on the follow-up survey about how we can do better. Okay, I will leave this poll open while I go to our Q&A. I'm also, okay. So there is a question about changes to immigration law. So immigration law, of course, is primarily a federal issue, and you probably noticed that it wasn't included in my federal update. We haven't seen any major changes to immigration law at this time. What you are probably familiar with is that the current administration has expressed some interest in pursuing or enforcing that law a little bit more, in their opinion, strongly than other administrations have done. And I won't talk about the case law and the executive orders in great detail because, again, there's a lot there that we could go into, and I'm not an expert on those topics. What I will say is that from a farm perspective, immigration law hasn't changed. There are two primary reasons why an immigration and customs enforcement official may show up at your operation, either an I-9 inspection or a site inspection, or excuse me, an I-9 audit or a site inspection. I-9 audits are typically, you should be provided notice. You have 3 days to respond before folks are going to be reviewing your I-9 forms to make sure that they're in line. And then a site inspection is when someone is out on your site, just like it sounds like, looking to inspect. You, of course, want to be thoughtful, as we've talked about HPAI and other biosecurity and farm security concerns, perhaps thinking about how you respond when any regulatory agency visits, whether that's ICE, whether that's DATCP, DNR, USDA. What is the protocol? Who are we calling? Are there private areas that are restricted, whether because they are private or for biosecurity reasons? You can't usually stop an agency from being in a public space. So if you have an on-farm store, they have every right to be there. But of course, if you're looking at an I-9 audit or a site inspection, make sure you're contacting your attorney and being aware of how you are addressing those issues. Because again, not encouraging anyone to break the law or say that anyone has, but we always want to be thoughtful about if someone is showing up at the farm and we're not expecting them, what biosecurity provisions and farm safety provisions or just general procedure to limit disruption to our workday and to our farm and our animals do we have in place? So always going through that thought process ahead of time before someone arrives. The other question that we have is, if local control is granted for solar and wind installations or other ag activities, do you think this is a precedent that could lead to taking down the livestock sighting law? It's a great question, and one that I don't have a great answer for. There is always an ongoing conflict between local control, state control, and federal control. It's sort of the nature of the setup of our government, right? And I think that isn't new, and it isn't going anywhere. So as we try to decide what issues should be handled at local, state, and federal level, I think those tensions are always going to be there on a variety of issues. Any other questions? I really appreciate everyone joining us and hanging out with us for an extra 10 minutes. It's great to hear your questions and have your interest in the changes in Wisconsin and federal ag law, as well as in the potential changes. Again, please go ahead and take a peek at the survey at go.wisc.edu/6377WI. I always appreciate your feedback about how we can do better in the future.